Hello. Today I'm going to be making a video comparing Davinci Resolve and Final Cut Pro X. Now I've already done a video like this before, but this time things are going to be a bit different because what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually edit a video in both programs. I'm going to throw in some screen recordings of the editing process so I can more clearly show the differences between the two programs. Let's get on with the edit. First of all, Final Cut Pro does open faster than Davinci Resolve, because that's really how you're going to choose your editing program. Before I can edit anything, I've got to get the footage into the editor. Resolve has an entire page dedicated to this purpose. All I'm using it for right now is to find the footage and drag it into the media panel. Final Cut Pro has an import menu that has some useful auto features, like audio and color analysis, although I'm not sure that they're good enough to be used in a professional circumstance. However, if you want Final Cut Pro to manage your media in a library, then there are some useful options here, but for now I'm leaving the files in place as I want to manage all the footage myself. Cool, so we have got all the footage we need. Time to start editing, and already we can see a pretty big difference in how the two programs work. Resolve uses the traditional NLE controls. Double click on a clip and it appears in the viewer. Scrub through the clip, set in and out points, then insert the clip into the timeline. However, Final Cut Pro tries to streamline this process. Instead of clicking on anything, you hover your mouse over the footage and the clip will play back in the single viewer as you move your mouse backwards and forwards. Click and drag to select the portion of the clip you want, then simply drag the selected portion into the timeline. Can this be a bit fiddly and annoying when you first start using it? Yes, it can. But once you get used to it, it's much faster and it's a more intuitive way of working. Fewer clicks, fewer UI buttons, fewer keyboard shortcuts. So let's have a look through our footage. It appears to be a video about making a weapon of mass destruction, a trebuchet. And look, what's this? Whoever shot this project was clearly an amazing and very talented filmmaker, because they shot an interview that will help us make sense of everything that's happening in this video. We can give the project a much more personal feeling too. I bet this interview is full of intelligent and insightful comments. The trebuchet, it spoke to me. In those planks of wood, I could feel it. It was saying, "Make me into a siege engine." This interview was shot with dual system sound, which means the audio is recorded separately. Both Resolve and Final Cut have audio syncing tools, but they can be a bit fiddly, and this is only one clip, so we'll synchronize them together manually. Sadly, in this interview, the interviewee does do a little bit of rambling. This is how it goes with all great technology. The telephone, the light bulb, the electric motor. But that's alright, we can cut that out very easily. Now this is where the biggest difference between the two programs becomes apparent. Normal timeline versus magnetic timeline. Now I will admit that the magnetic timeline is one of the biggest hurdles that editors have to overcome when they start using Final Cut Pro X. Yes, it's daunting when you change one thing, the entire timeline moves and shifts around that change. But if you give it enough time and start to figure it out, it becomes a very intuitive way of editing. Moving clips around, especially a whole bunch of clips, becomes easy as the timeline automatically adjusts itself. It's impossible to accidentally overwrite anything when you add new media into your timeline or delete clips. And you won't get those random gaps in your timelines either, and you don't have to switch between tools as often. I know it's one of the most controversial changes to Final Cut version 10, when Apple abandoned version 7, but I think most of the time, it is a superior way of editing, and as a result, I'm making much faster progress in Final Cut Pro than I am in Davinci Resolve. In Final Cut, there's just much less to think about. You can nearly edit at the speed you can think. There are some small differences in how each program handles clip retiming. It's actually quite difficult for me to pick a favorite. Final Cut Pro makes it easy to use a speed other than a preset. You can drag the little bar at the top to change the speed that the clip plays back at. But Resolve's retiming graph does make doing speed ramps much easier. So far, the editing done in Final Cut Pro has taken about 75% of the time that it's taken to do in Resolve. But things are about to change. Next, I'm going to do some minor audio corrections, such as adding a limiter, a compressor, and a de-esser. This is where Resolve's more traditional track-based structure does come in handy. Once I've tweaked the settings for the track, I don't need to touch the individual clips. In Final Cut Pro, most of the audio corrections are going to be done using filters. Okay, so copying the filters from one clip to another, it's pretty easy if you know the copy attribute shortcut, but still, it's an extra step, especially if you want to change any of the settings later. I also prefer the overall UI for sound in Davinci Resolve. Rather than being confined to a filter and an inspector panel like in Final Cut, Resolve has a whole page dedicated to audio, the Fairlight page. Having lots of easily accessible controls makes it easier to work with, and more importantly, faster. I also really like the way Resolve groups the limiter and compressor together into this dynamics panel, and how the controls are more visual than the ones in Final Cut. And now that all the audio mixing is done, we're going to move on to doing the color correction and the color grading. But this is where Davinci Resolve is a bit lacking. No, it really isn't. Davinci Resolve is probably the best bit of color grading software in the world. It has an incredible feature set, incredible color tools. It's the most powerful tool for color grading that I have ever used. So many feature films, commercial projects, advertisements, all those types of things have been done in Resolve. If you look at the number of Sundance films color graded in Resolve, it's basically all of them. So, whilst I may have lost a bit of time in the editing phase, in Resolve, I'm able to make it up again during color grading. I'm not doing anything crazy in either of these programs, just balancing out the brightness levels, adding some contrast and saturation, white balancing over shots, and I'm also doing a few secondary corrections when they're needed. The color tools are so much better in Resolve. Even just the simple color wheel controls feel more precise. And I love the auto white balance feature in Resolve. Final Cut Pro does have auto balance color, but I find it's a bit too aggressive. I also really like the secondary color correction options. You can use the qualifier to select just the bright bit of the sky. You can use hue versus saturation curves to dial back an oversaturated color. Yes, it's entirely possible to do all these things in Final Cut, but it feels clunkier, and it's definitely slower. Even the simple act of being able to group together clips in Resolve is very beneficial to my workflow. Now that the color grade is finished, and surprise surprise, I have to say that I definitely prefer how the color grade turned out in Resolve, it's time to export. Even though these two edits are not identical, they're using different footage and they're slightly different lengths, they're still similar enough for export times to be interesting. Both videos are being exported at 1080p, 24-ish FPS, and in H.264. I'm using a 2019 iMac with an i9, 40GB of RAM, and a Vega Pro 48 GPU. Whilst Resolve has a lot of optimizations to make it faster, it still can't quite compete. The Resolve render finishes in 1 minute and 25 seconds, which is still very good. But the Final Cut Pro render finishes in 51 seconds. Final Cut Pro is very well optimized for Apple's hardware, so there's really no surprise that it was faster. And now we have two finished edits. In a minute I'm going to talk about what it was like, differences between editing in the two programs, and who I think should use which. But before I do that, here is one of the finished edits. I'm interested to see if you can figure out which one this video was edited in, Davinci Resolve or Final Cut Pro. I think it's always been a dream of mine to build a proper siege engine, my very own trebuchet. None of this modern catapult nonsense, no, a proper siege engine with a counterweight and a sling. I set about building one. It was the only thing to do. The first step was to make the frame, and I knew it would need to be strong because there was going to be lots of counterweights. I bolted 2 bits of wood together, I screwed 2 bits of wood together, attached that to a 3rd bit of wood along the bottom, and that made the side frame of the trebuchet. I made a wooden counterweight bucket that would hold house bricks. You need a good solid counterweight for a good trebuchet launch, so house bricks were the obvious solution. And all that was needed was to join the two parts, the two sides together with a bit of MDF board in between them, and I had the first working prototype of my trebuchet. I assembled, put everything together, added a sling, and at the end of a weekend, I had a functioning trebuchet.
Whoa! That swings a lot more than I thought it would.
But it still had several flaws, and I wanted more. Firstly, the main axle that held the throwing arm into place, it was bending all over the place. It was too weak. It was never going to survive a proper siege. And where's the use in that? You need a trebuchet that's going to function. So I had this second bit of plastic, and I sort of sheathed the original bit of plastic, pushed them together, cut them down to size, and then I had a much, much stronger pivoting axle to hold the trebuchet together. I was very proud of that. And that did work a bit better, but I came to the conclusion that the counterweights, they were just going to be too small. They weren't providing enough rotational force to launch my projectile into the heart of the enemy castle. So I redesigned the counterweight box. I made it a bit wider so I could stack more house bricks. In the end, it could hold 5 house bricks, and I figured that was a good amount of weight. That was at least 10 kilograms worth of counterweight, which for a small trebuchet should be enough to get a good solid throw. And with the increased counterweight and the solid axle, the trebuchet was performing much better. But it wasn't enough, and after performing some measurements, I came to the conclusion that the throwing arm was too long, and it was very, very sad to have to cut down the throwing arm of my mighty trebuchet. For the good of the trebuchet, to get more range, to get more power, it had to be done. So I cut the end off the trebuchet to give me a 5-to-1 ratio between throwing arm and counterweight arm, and that performed much, much better. Bit of adjustment to the sling, and I had a functioning siege engine. I was really proud of it. It worked. It did work. It worked very well. I was ready to go and siege some of my enemies. A video of the trebuchet was subsequently posted to Facebook to establish the dominance of the trebuchet over those rubbish, pathetic little catapults. And there was a very interesting suggestion that came up, which was why not put it on wheels? The idea being, you see, that normally when a trebuchet fires, the counterweight arm with the box of weights, it falls in an arc, and that's less efficient. So if you put it on wheels, and the whole thing could slide forwards, the counterweight would be falling more in a straight line, and that would give you more momentum, more force. So I did the only reasonable thing. I cut out some wheels, put some holes in the trebuchet frame, attached the wheels, and it worked much better. I got a lot more distance out of the trebuchet, which I was surprised about, and it recoiled a fair way too, which, I mean, it's good. It protects the trebuchet, and it helps to show off the sheer power of this mighty siege engine. But a mighty trebuchet deserves mighty wheels, and these wheels were just too small. So subsequently, I had to abandon these small, insulting wheels, and I routed out some much bigger ones. They were more effective, they could roll over the ground, and they matched the stature of the trebuchet. You know, a powerful weapon deserves big wheels. My other problem was that the sling, well, I just couldn't control when it released. The sling left when it wanted to leave, and as much as I want to trust the trebuchet to know when to release its own sling, I just wanted a bit more control. I wanted to have more input into the release timings, the finer workings of the mechanism, if you will. So I added on an adjustable angle for the sling release pins. You could pivot it. I was able to make some fine-tuning adjustments, and I got even more distance and power out of my mighty trebuchet. If you haven't figured out which program that edit was done in, then it was the Davinci Resolve edit. I'm going to put the Final Cut Pro edit at the end of the video in case you want to watch that too. They are slightly different, they're edited in different styles, bit of a different music, and they're using different footage, so if you want to check that out, it'll be at the end of the video if you want to have a look. So, what was it like editing in each program, and which one should you use? Well, first of all, media management. If you want your editing program to deal with storing and organizing all your footage, then Final Cut Pro is the clear winner. But for any complicated projects, you'll want to do all the file management yourself, in which case there's no real difference. But for the most important role of an editing program, editing. This is definitely going to involve some personal preference. If you want to use a traditional track-based workflow, then obviously you'll want to use Resolve. But I think it's worth not ruling out Final Cut Pro purely because of its magnetic timeline. I find it easier and faster to use, and in general I do prefer it over traditional track-based workflow. There's not a huge difference when it comes to audio editing. I'd say Resolve is slightly ahead. I really like the Fairlight page with all of its audio tools, and I will admit this is where tracks can be very useful. But in reality, any proper audio editing program like Logic Pro, Avid Pro Tools, or Adobe Audition will be far superior, so I wouldn't pick either of these programs purely because of their audio tools. And as far as color grading, well, there's really not much to say. It's not that Final Cut Pro has bad color tools, in fact they're pretty decent, certainly enough to get by with. But Resolve started out life purely as a color program, and nothing else matches it. So, which of these programs should you use? Well, that's a very complicated question, but here goes. Use Final Cut Pro if you want a program that will deal with all the files for you, if you want to edit as quickly as physically possible, if you're only going to be editing and not doing any real color grading, or if you want a good performance on a lower powered computer such as a MacBook Air. Use Davinci Resolve if you want a program that uses a traditional track-based editing workflow, you want to do a lot of color grading, you use a PC, or if you want a free editing program, as the free version has nearly everything you need. Also, while I didn't do any visual effects or motion graphics in this comparison, if you do want to do those things, that's another point for Davinci Resolve. Yeah, with Final Cut Pro, you can get Motion 5 as an extra program, but Davinci Resolve has Fusion built in. It's a very powerful compositor, which is node-based. I'm not going to go into any detail at all about it because that would take a whole nother video, but for visual effects and motion graphics, I'm going to say that's a slight edge there to Davinci Resolve. So there you go. I hope this real-world example was helpful. Now I know the edits are a bit different in both programs, so okay, it's not 100% an entirely fair test, but if they were exactly the same, then I would probably die of boredom having to edit the exact same thing twice. Plus, it would have been a bit unnatural, and I wanted to get this to be as close as possible to a real-world editing scenario, so there we are. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please consider leaving a like and subscribing so as not to miss any new videos. I hope that all castles in your path are easily sieged with your own trebuchet. And if you want to see the Final Cut Pro video, then here it is. I think it's always been a dream of mine to build a proper siege engine, my very own trebuchet. Seeing the mighty siege engines of the past, the elegant, the huge trebuchets and their ability to destroy castles from practically a kilometer away, I've always wanted to capture some of that essence myself. So I set about building one. It was the only thing to do. I didn't really have a fixed idea in mind, of course. I thought about it as I went, and as I started to cut the wood, the design, it made itself apparent to me. The trebuchet was already there in the wood. I had to unlock it. I had to craft it. Well, the first step was to make the frame, and I knew it would need to be strong because there was going to be lots of counterweight, and you needed a very strong, very resistant structure. So I screwed 2 bits of wood together, attached that to a 3rd bit of wood along the bottom, and that made the side frame of the trebuchet. All that was needed was to join the 2 parts, the 2 sides together with a bit of MDF board in between them, and I had the first working prototype of my trebuchet. But it became very apparent that it was not going to stand up to the stress of battle. It would tear itself to pieces, so I had to reinforce it. I added in this crossbar at the front, and that did the trick. The trebuchet was much more solid, much more rigid, much more dignified. I made a wooden counterweight bucket that would hold house bricks. You know, you need a good solid counterweight for a good trebuchet launch, so house bricks were the obvious solution. The bucket held the house bricks very nicely. I assembled, put everything together, added a sling, and at the end of a weekend I had a functioning trebuchet. But it still had several flaws, and I wanted more. Firstly, the main axle that held the throwing arm into place, it was bending all over the place. It was too weak. It was never going to survive a proper siege. I had this second bit of plastic, and I sheathed the original bit of plastic, pushed them together, cut them down to size, and then I had a much stronger pivoting axle to hold the trebuchet together. And that did work a bit better, but I came to the conclusion that the counterweights, they were just going to be too small. They weren't providing enough rotational force to launch my projectile into the heart of the enemy castle. So I redesigned the counterweight box. I made it a bit wider so I could stack more house bricks. And with the increased counterweight and the solid axle, the trebuchet was performing much better. But it wasn't enough, and after performing some measurements, I came to the conclusion that the throwing arm was too long. So I cut the end off the trebuchet to give me a 5-to-1 ratio between throwing arm and counterweight arm, and that performed much better. Bit of adjustment to the sling, and I had a functioning siege engine. I was really proud of it. A video of the trebuchet was subsequently posted to Facebook to establish the dominance of the trebuchet over those rubbish, pathetic little catapults. And there was a very interesting suggestion that came up, which was, why not put it on wheels? Cut out some wheels, put some holes in the trebuchet frame, attach the wheels, and it worked much better. I got a lot more distance out of the trebuchet. But a mighty trebuchet deserves mighty wheels, and these wheels were just too small. So subsequently, I had to abandon these small, insulting wheels, and I routed out some much bigger ones. They were more effective, they could roll over the ground, and they matched the stature of the trebuchet. You know, a powerful weapon deserves big wheels. My other problem was that the sling, well, I just couldn't control when it released. The sling left when it wanted to. So I added on an adjustable angle for the sling release pins. You could pivot it. By doing that, I was able to make some fine-tuning adjustments, and I got even more distance and power out of my mighty trebuchet. A little more tuning, and the trebuchet was at its maximum potential. It was striking fear into the hearts of anything that stood in its path. But there was one final test, one ultimate goal. Could I launch a tennis ball right over the top of my house? Well, I set about trying to find out.
2, 1. No.
I will admit there were many failed experiments.
Oh.
Many misfires, which was very disheartening, but I mean, this is how it goes with all great technology.
No.
I didn't give up. I kept on. I persevered. I kept on trying these launches, and eventually I succeeded.
3, 2, 1. Yes! It worked!
A tennis ball right over the top of the house. Up on one side, down on the other. A home run, and out of the park. The trebuchet was finished. The trebuchet was ready for battle. If in the future, if the situation gets worse, if the things deteriorate, well, at least I'll be able to defend myself and siege any building I need to, now that I have my very own functioning trebuchet.